The first bill on the calendar for the day is House File 36. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 36, number 2 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to employment, establishing worker safety requirements, the third engrossment.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, the author of the bill, Representative Greenman, to explain the bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This bill rests on the simple premise that all Minnesota workers deserve to be safe and respected at work, no matter where you work, who you work for, or what your background is. It protects Minnesota warehouse workers by updating our worker safety standards with common sense notice and transparency requirements. That companies notify warehouse workers of any quotas they're expected to meet and provide workers with access to their own data on how they're performing their quotas. If workers are given the information and the power that they need, they can keep themselves and their coworkers safe. Work shouldn't hurt, but for Minnesotans working in Amazon's warehouses right now, it does. In committee after committee, now for 2 years, we've heard workers describe being forced to work at a grueling and relentless pace. We've heard talk about a culture of anxiety and fear, working under intense electronic surveillance that tracks their every move. Workers who push themselves to the brink, not having time to eat lunch, to use the restrooms because of the relentless pace. If workers can't meet their high quotas, they don't keep pace, then they're penalized or they're fired and they're replaced with new employees, and the cycle, that churn of workers in and out at a rate twice as high as other workplaces and warehouses, starts all over again. Listening to Minnesota workers and then looking at the data paints an alarming picture that requires us to act with this bill. The National Employment Law Project reported, and their updated data reflects that the business model has led to an injury rate that's 1.5 times higher the injury rate to workers in non-Amazon warehouses and 3 times higher than the rate of other private industry. These injuries are almost all preventable musculoskeletal injuries from the rapid repetitive motion of pulling, of lifting, of twisting without sufficient recovery time, the kind of injuries that last a lifetime. So for members who were here last session, you may remember we passed this same bill off the House floor. And since then, the problem has only gotten worse. New data from 2021 shows that the injuries have actually risen by 10% from the already staggering injury rates. These are attributable to the management practices that force excessive pace of speed through algorithm surveillance and a discipline that has been pioneered by Amazon. It doesn't have to be this way. It shouldn't be this way. And in fact, for workers in other warehouses, it often isn't this way. The fact is that our safety standards have not kept up with a high-tech and cutting-edge model, and it causes workers harm. Minnesota OSHA can only enforce standards that exist, and we don't have a standard to cover these dangerous practices. That's why we need this bill. It's a modest and common-sense bill that simply requires large warehouses to notify their workers of any quotas they're expected to meet. It gives workers the right to access their own personal their performance data, and it ensures that any quota performance standard can't interfere with their legal rights. And to ensure that companies comply with this notice standard, it gives them the rights to enforce their rights under the statute. This bill is a common sense response to a big safety problem. It will ensure that workers have what they need. Members, I'd ask you to vote yes.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Greenman moves to amend House File number 36, the third engrossment. The amendment is coded A6.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This amendment is an officer's amendment that makes a number of updates based on feedback we've gotten for the last couple of months of conversations with the retailers, with Amazon, and others to clarify language. Just a few highlights of what it does. It adds a definition for aggregated employee work speed data. It clarifies that employee work speed data doesn't include personal earning statements. It reduces to 1 day the time necessary to provide notice. It clarifies what discipline means, and it removes a severability clause that's redundant and unnecessary under Minnesota statute.
There is an amendment to the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Greenman moves to amend her amendment to House File number 36, the third engrossment. The amendment to the amendment is coded A7.
On the A7 amendment, Representative Greenman.
This amendment simply clarifies a typo in the underlying amendment.
Discussion to the Greenman authors' amendments. On the A7 amendment, all those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. On the underlying A6 amendment, all those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. There's another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
NISCA moves to amend House File Number 36, the third engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A5.
The member from Anoka, Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. This bill, on its whole, I think is bad policy and unnecessary. We do have an administrative agency that is tasked with dealing with this, and we just were handed out some data, I guess, showing that from that administrative agency that they've figured out there's a problem that they can deal with. But what we were presented with in committee, and what I've heard from advocates for this bill, is that the Department of Labor and Industry needs more tools to deal with. But what we don't need is a brand new private right of action that creates additional costs and mandates on our already struggling businesses. And so the A5 amendment is simply to allow the administrative agency that we have oversight over, that we can provide the tools for, to be the primary the primary agency dealing with this, instead of just giving a brand new private right of action to trial lawyers, which will lead to frivolous, attorney-driven lawsuits that, again, are going to be costly on our employers to defend themselves against even claims that might be unwarranted. The litigation costs, I believe, of House File 36 will affect supply chains throughout Minnesota. They will cost businesses and consumers across Minnesota without any additional legal protections. We can trust the Department of Labor and Industry to enforce these provisions if we do go down this road, instead of creating a new attorney-driven private right of action that's going to create bad incentives for bad litigation. I'm particularly concerned about the retaliation provision on line 3.27 that creates a situation where an employee, if they happen to go talk to a smart enough lawyer, is going to just request worker speed data whenever they have a performance problem, and that's going to create a situation in which employers are not able to deal with employees who are genuinely not doing the job right. Again, we heard in committee that we need to give Dolly tools, but what we don't need to do is to create a brand new private right of action with attorney's fees that's going to create bad incentives for trial lawyers and a tough situation for employers, and more costs piled onto our supply chains, which are already overburdened, which is already driving inflation on Minnesotans. So I ask for support for the A5 amendment. Thank you.
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, I would ask you to vote no on this amendment. This deletes the power of workers themselves who may have been injured by this provision to seek to remedy the situation. I absolutely, and this is why the bill built in OSHA, MN OSHA, and Dolly oversight, but we also need to make sure that the workers themselves have that power. There's a private right of action in other DLI labor standards, including the Minnesota Fair Labor Standards Act, the whistleblower protections, OSHA discrimination cases, and WISA. So this is something we often have. And as all lawyers know, frivolous lawsuits are kicked out of court, and there's a mechanism to deal with that. But what we do know is that workers should have the ability to help themselves, and what we're seeing right now is they don't. And so we need to make sure that this language is in there. Please vote no.
Further discussion on the A5. All those in Representative Niska?
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. The fact of the matter is, frivolous litigation does not just get kicked out of court. It often goes through costly discovery. It goes through to summary judgment often, and it creates costs on our supply chain. As Representative Greenman said, there are a lot of labor statutes already that will protect genuinely problematic labor standards and practices and provide private rights of action. This one, though, is just unnecessary. It's creating, touch foul kinds of liability that creates bad incentives. Please vote yes.
All those in favor of the A5 amendment, please vote aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion does not prevail. The amendment is not adopted. There are no further amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
House File Number 36, third reading as amended.
Third reading as amended. The member from Ramsey, Representative Hussein, to the bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. House File 36, which would address the issue of the warehouse workers' safety. All Minnesota workers deserve to be safe, respected at the workplace. Warehouse workers are exhausted, and we need to support them now more than ever. This bill has been on the floor for a couple of years, and I want to thank Amy Greenman, Representative Greenman, for bringing this bill forward and working on for a couple of years. There's nothing wrong with this bill. This bill will address the people that you see right now in the chamber. Many of my community show up. Many of the unions show up, and they're advocating for safety. We need to ensure that warehouse employees are safe so that they can return to their family when they've done for their job. We are not a machine. We heard it in the committees. Many of the testifiers showed up and had a concern about this bill. They showed up because they needed justice. They showed up because they need their voice to be heard. Many of them their language is English is their second language, and they do not understand. That's why we need them an opportunity for them, Amazon and any other warehouses, to be addressed that concern that community show up. No one should be unsafe in their workplace. I urge all my colleagues and members to vote yes for this great bill so we can address the community who has the voiceless and who's been showing up in the labors. Approximately 200 to 300 workers from Amazon and other places because they want their voice to be heard. Please vote green. Thank you.
The member from Morrison, Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. It's important to know for this body and for the Minnesotans who are watching today that this bill does not specifically target Amazon, and in fact, it's going to make us less competitive for distribution centers across this state. So would Representative Greenman yield?
She will yield. Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Greenman, can you list for us certain safety examples from other employers outside of Amazon that would be defined in the scope of this language and the definitions that have had safety violations and the workers that you've heard from?
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So what this bill does is says you have to tell your workers if they're being held accountable to a performance standard or a quota, and you have to show them their data. That's all it says. And there's lots of warehouses that are doing that now, and if they're already doing that, then they'll be able to comply with this bill. What we're trying to deal with is a cutting-edge issue, something we're seeing today at Amazon warehouses, but as we have seen with logistics, as we have seen with small businesses, what we know about Amazon is that they are one of the biggest companies in the world, and when something starts at Amazon, in a couple of years, we see it at other places. So what we're doing is we're addressing a safety standard that doesn't currently exist in Minnesota statute, and we're doing it for today for Amazon workers, but for tomorrow, it'll be workers at all of our big warehouses, which in many cases, as we heard and you heard in committee, UPS, Cisco, they're already doing this. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that there's a uniform standard, that if you're being held accountable to a quota, you know what it is, and you're being given the data.
Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would Representative Greenman yield to another question?
She will. Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and Representative Greenman. What steps has the Department of Labor and Industry done with current law on the books to protect these workers as it relates to these quotas?
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We don't currently have laws on the books that require this. So if you made a complaint that said I'm being held accountable to a quota and haven't been shown it, there actually wouldn't be a law on the book for OSHA to enforce. Just like in 2007 when we passed the Safe Patient Handling Standard, we need a standard that OSHA can enforce, and that's what this bill does.
Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. This is important because this goes far beyond Amazon. Amazon is one business in this state, but this bill, from the way that I understand it, would impact 28 non-Amazon warehouses across this state, despite whether they have these different quotas for their workers. And so this is the heavy hand of government making us less competitive in this state. And frankly, I love what I have heard from the other employers in this state who have distribution centers and the points that they have made, that they've been working with their employees, many of them union employees, by the way, to make sure that their workers are well taken care of, because this isn't an issue for UPS, for FedEx, and for others. So why are we using the heavy hand of government to impact members, again, 28 other distribution centers across this state who aren't dealing or who don't have this problem? Representative Greenman, would you yield to another question?
She will yield. Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Greenman, why do we need to have a heavy hand of government to impact 28 other distribution centers who don't currently deal with this issue today?
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think I answered that question, but I'll answer it again. When we see business practices, especially ones on the cutting edge that are hurting people, it's our job in this state to examine those practices, to look at what workers are telling us, and to act. So when we hear that other businesses, and we heard that in testimony in support of this bill, we heard folks from UPS, we heard folks from Cisco say it is only good practice to tell people what quota, what performance standard you're keeping them, you're holding them to, and have access to their data. But they're not all businesses are doing that. And in fact, one of the biggest and growing businesses. So when we talk about competitivity and what our businesses need, the turnover and the injury rates that we're seeing are not good for Minnesota workers. They're not good for Minnesota businesses. We have a workforce shortage. And so when we talk about what we need right now to keep Minnesota competitive, I think keeping workers healthy and safe, these are preventable injuries, is a critical piece. And that's what this bill does.
Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. If you were listening, you heard that Representative Greenman doesn't have other examples of the way that other workers across the state in distribution centers that aren't Amazon, that this is actually an issue. So instead, we're being punitive and adding additional regulation and burden upon those businesses and adding penalties as well. And so that's a big reason that I'm going to be opposing this bill today. It's because it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to add these sorts of punitive measures when we have a place in our workforce today where workers can find the different businesses that are treating them well and that have been negotiated for with labor unions. And so that's why I'll be opposing this bill today, and I encourage a no vote on this bill.
The member from Chisago, Representative New.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And would Representative Greenman yield to another question?
She will yield. Representative New. Brindley.
Thank you. And thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you, Representative Greenman. And thank you for passing out this article. I assume it's an article, Key Findings on, this is specifically related to Amazon workers. It talks about increasing number of worker injuries, an overwhelming number of injuries that were of the most serious kind, etc. And I'm wondering if you can help us understand, in the last couple of years, how many investigations have Dolly and Minnesota OSHA participated in with Amazon, or how many complaints have they responded to?
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative New Brindley. So we've discussed this quite at length in committee. The first thing I'd say, which I will say again, which is we don't currently have a standard around this. The things that are hurting people, the way that folks are getting hurt, is this relentless pace of not knowing what kind of quota, what kind of performance standard they have to meet. People are speeding up. We heard talks of surveillance and fear of getting fired. And in that culture, people are not taking time to rest. They're not taking time to get help. And they're getting injured from these musculoskeletal lifting and stowing and storing. We don't have a standard around that. And so there is no standard to enforce. What we have heard and what we heard in committee, right, is OSHA's 50 inspectors for the entire state of Minnesota can't enforce a standard that isn't actually in law. And that's why we're going to pass this bill.
Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And would Representative Greenman continue to yield?
She will yield. Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I just want to clarify. So, Representative Greenman, you are telling us here today that there is no standard in law about workplace injury. That's what I'm hearing, because I'm referencing very specifically injuries that have taken place. And you are saying that even when there is injury, that does not fall under the purview of Minnesota OSHA or DOLI. We're talking about actual injuries that have taken place. I'm not sure. Maybe I am mistaken. Perhaps not all injuries are covered. But I'm really trying to understand this injury piece.
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There is a general duty clause that when OSHA is responding to a complaint they look at, it's very fact specific. We heard a lot about it from our OSHA director in committee, and I will not claim to be an OSHA expert. But what I do know is the things that are hurting people now are not like a loose machinery that a worker didn't fix, or that the business didn't fix. What's hurting people is the pace that's happening. It's a speed up. And we don't have a standard for that. And so to say, no, I did not say that there's no worker injury standards. But what OSHA does when they go in, they do a very under current law and this general duty standard, which applies to across the board, they do a very fact-specific investigation, and they only do it in response to serious complaints and serious injuries. What this bill does is deal with the fact that in warehouses, you need to keep your body safe by working at a pace. And when we talk about, I think Representative Schultz talked about some of the other places, UPS, others, they've used ergonomics and industrial engineers to figure out what pace we should be working at in order to keep people safe. We don't have a standard that's required under Minnesota law, and we don't even have a standard that requires workers to know what pace they're being held accountable to when they're being held accountable to it. That's what this bill does.
Representative New Brindley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I guess I will point out that I don't think we got the answer specifically, but Minnesota OSHA and DOLI testified in committee that they have not investigated a single complaint of injury in the state of Minnesota in regards to these things. Not one, not a single complaint. So if this bill was really about workplace safety, Minnesota OSHA and DOLI, well, frankly, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say if this was really a workforce safety issue, that they would be investigating those issues. And if they have not investigated legitimate claims, then I'll tell you what, Governor Walz's administration has some serious answering to do for their lack of accountability. And so it's either one or the other. Either the safety issues that are being purported as necessary to fix with this bill language are so serious that it requires legislative action, or, frankly, the Walz administration is not doing their job. They're not doing their job, and I guess I'm not sure that either of those are good answers. This is not about workplace safety. Frankly, let's be honest here. This is about collecting information, perhaps in the future for purposes of collective bargaining. This is about gathering information about proprietary work processes. This is not about workplace safety. This is about protectionism. And if we were going to do the right thing, we would frankly let Minnesota OSHA and we would let DOLI do their jobs, because I am presuming that they have done their jobs appropriately.
Madam Speaker, members, I rise to oppose the bill. Representative Greenman, we've seen this in committee, I think, the last several years, and for some of the reasons, these are why some of the reasons. We have DOLI that testified in committee with many of the employees, And in asking Dolly if they have had any phone calls or investigated the Amazon warehouse particularly, the answer was none. So either the fact is that there were no injuries or they weren't serious enough to contact MnOSHA or Dolly. Now, members, for the last 13 years, I have supported some worker safety bills. I think many folks in here that have been here for a number of years has. And I'm proud of some of the work I've done to protect Minnesota workers. And it's never going to be perfect. So it is oftentimes that things will have to come to this body for us to do to support worker safety. But two, we also must support the employers. Representative Greenman, you said the pace in which some of the workers are going is very harmful. I'd say the pace in which the Democrats are going this session is very harmful at such a fast pace. But yet, not one of the testifiers had stated that they contacted OSHA or Dolly. Now, on the Department of Labor and Industry, they do a fine job, I presume, by protecting Minnesota's employees and employers. They have certain laws that we passed here. Madam Speaker, you probably voted for some of these as well. Matter of fact, if you go to their front page of worker protection, it says this: worker rights and protections. Our agency helps protect the rights and the safety and health of all workers. We educate employers and employees about their rights and responsibilities under Minnesota employment and safety and health laws that we pass. But yet you did not convince any of us on the committee on this side that this was about worker safety, because Dolly had admitted that they had no investigation. Now, we had this bill come up a couple years ago in Zoom. You guys remember it was doing Zoom? And there was a number of testifiers as well, including Dolly. And even then, Madam Speaker, they had no reports of these injuries at Amazon. Now, I'm not going to let Amazon off the hook. Certainly not. We must make sure that they are providing safety to their employees. Without their employees, there is no Amazon, wouldn't you say? That is the fact. But there's been no evidence whatsoever to indicate that their workers are unsafe. And then for big government to come in, now just think about this. By law, we can come into a business, a manufacturing, a warehouse, and tell them exactly how to run their business. How many quotas, how many boxes, how many times you can put this fiddle-faddle together, or whatever. It's big-handed government going into a private business and telling them how fast their employees or how slow their employees should work. Now, Representative Greenman said that some of the complaints where they couldn't have a chance to go to the restroom or have lunches. Well, frankly, we have laws for that. Thank goodness. What, for an 8-hour day, I believe by state law, an employee is required to have a half-an-hour lunch and 2 15-minute breaks. Now, if that is not happening in this Amazon warehouse, because that was the only testifying name mentioned of all warehouses, if that's not happening there, then how come MnOSHA or Dolly was not notified? Aren't you curious? Representative Greenman, if you would yield for a question, please.
She will yield. Representative McDonald.
Madam Speaker, Representative Greenman, you gave some very good testimony and you made some very good points, certainly, but you did not yet even prove one iota of the claims that were given by the testifiers. Not one did you back it up. Did you go visit Amazon yourself and visit the facilities? Did you check with Dolly to see how many complaints were and the fact that if they are in violation of the law, because we have state health laws, that how come Dolly then wasn't participating in pursuing justice for the unsafe work environments?
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I actually did go out and spend a couple hours at the Amazon warehouse in Shakopee. I have spent now 2 years talking to not just Amazon, but also the retailers and also the workers. And so when you say there's not one iota of evidence, I am seeing, and that we actually have many of the workers who've been here committee after committee after committee who tell the story about what it feels like on this House floor. A year ago, a GOP colleague across the aisle, Representative Juergens, said, I called my friend who worked at Amazon to see if these stories were true, and he said, absolutely, they were true. So when I think about what is happening, I listen to the evidence of what we're hearing from the workers, what we're seeing from the data. That OSHA data is self-reported. And so that about 10 workers, out of it, 1 in 10 workers, 10 workers out of every 100 getting hurt, that's self-reported data from these warehouses. And so that's the iota of evidence is what we continue to hear from workers year after year.
Representative McDonald.
Madam Speaker, thank you. Yes, I see the folks in the gallery, and I saw them at committee as well, and I didn't doubt their honesty. I doubted the fact that how come not one of those claims were given to Dolly? We have state laws in the state of Minnesota that protects employees. So why aren't we using them? If the current laws aren't working, what makes you think that this law will work? To the workers of Minnesota, you have rights for your health and safety. If you believe your employer is taking advantage of you or they're breaking state laws, health laws and safety, then contact Dolly, contact Governor Walz, and they should be doing their job. And perhaps they are. But yet we haven't heard in committee that they were. They said they haven't been contacted, even from 2 years ago. So just to think about it, again, this bill, over-encompassing, and it goes in, government will come into your manufacturing or your warehouse and tell you how many employees you can have, how hard they can work, how many gadgets they can produce in certain times a day. We already have health laws and safety laws that regulate that anymore, and it's just not good for business, and it's not good for Minnesotans. We already have a worker shortage. We can't continue to make this difficult for both employers, job creators, and its employees. Madam Speaker.
The member from Scott, Representative Tabke.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker and members. And the MSP1 is the largest Amazon facility in the state of Minnesota, and that is located in Shakopee. It came to Shakopee while I was mayor, and we had a lot of discussion about if it was a good thing for our community or not a good thing for our community. In the end, it didn't matter because it was zoning laws, and we weren't going to be able to change that and keep that from happening. But what we have learned since that time is the fact that Amazon treats their employees like robots. They treat the people not as humans, not as neighbors, not as friends, but as robots. And they have a very clear, very limited, very narrow amount of information that anybody gets as to why and how they could be laid off the next day, how they could not have a job the next day to support their families and support their loved ones. And so there are many stories of folks that are my constituents who have been, they complain one day and days later they are laid off by the app. There's not anybody who talks to them. There's not anybody who discusses the issues with them. They're just gone. They don't get to work anymore. And it is not a way that we should be doing business in the state of Minnesota. And so I very highly thank Representative Greenman for bringing this forward and pushing it to make sure that we're able to pass this in Minnesota to protect workers, to protect people, and to make sure that our workers in Minnesota are treated like humans and not like robots. So thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Meckland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Will Representative Greenman yield for a question?
She will yield. Representative Meckland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Greenman, we've heard a lot now from Representative McDonald and New Brindley, and we heard a lot of this in committee about all these people that have testified of all these injuries. Everybody's discussed how none of these have been investigated yet. OSHA did testify that they did, I believe it was 1,500 investigations in total last year, and they have 50 investigators, right? I believe was the number. So, of all the complaints that were mentioned, and some of them were many different types of injuries, have they reached out to you since committee, or have you to them, to find out why they have not taken any of these complaints serious?
Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative Meckland. And I think I'm probably going to repeat what the OSHA director said in committee, but I did pull up here the general duty clause, because what we're talking about is the general duty of employers to keep folks safe. But the problem is that currently what is hurting people is an algorithm, is a method that isn't currently accounted for in Minnesota law. Just like with the Safe Patient Handling Act that we passed in 2007, we saw a problem. So the general duty clause says employers have the responsibility to provide a safe and healthy workplace that is free from serious recognized hazards. This is commonly known as the general duty clause. Right now what we're saying is we are learning that a hazard that is hurting people is the requirement that people are being kept to an opaque standard, that they're not being told about, they're speeding up, and the combination of surveillance and a culture of fear is creating that hazard. But we don't currently have that in Minnesota law, which is what we're trying to do today.
Representative Meckland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Greenman, there was many, many testifiers who had different injuries. One of them, I believe it was a pretty serious leg injury, but that from their testimony, it didn't sound like it had anything to do with being driven. It was just a bad accident. But not even that was investigated. There's clearly something run amok with the administration and OSHA not being out there. My history in the past is they were very aggressive on any type of injury whatsoever. So there's clearly something falling short. But based on their testimony, if they have done a total of 1,500 investigations throughout the entire state with a mere 50 people, that means they're doing less than one every 2 weeks, right in there, right? One every 10 days. And so there was a question as to whether or not they needed more investigators to be able to handle the load, but it doesn't seem like they're going out to too many places if they have all these complaints. I am very concerned that with all the testimony that was given in committee on this issue, and with all the different types of injuries, I get some of them have to do with the being pushed at a higher pace, but that's not what they all said. So there's a big flaw, and I agree with what was said earlier that if they're not getting done what they should be getting done now to protect the people, what is creating a new law going to do? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Further discussion. The author of the bill, the member from Hennepin, Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, members, for the discussion today. I just, from this conversation, just want to make sure it's clear what this bill does. What it does is it says if you have a performance standard, if you have a quota that you're tracking, you need to tell workers what it is and give them access to their data. That's what this bill does. It doesn't tell companies what the standards are. It doesn't tell companies how many workers they can have. It doesn't even tell companies they need to have a standard. What it does say, if you have one, you need to tell workers what it is. And you're absolutely right, Representative Brindley. This is about gathering information. It's about the information that companies are gathering on workers and not sharing with them. It is about the fact that what we have seen in this algorithm, and again, today we're talking about Amazon, but tomorrow, and as we have seen, nobody can deny the impact that Amazon has had on our logistics system, on our delivery system, on how businesses get products to market. So we know what starts today at an Amazon warehouse with a complicated high-tech algorithm that is treating people, as Representative Tapke said, as we heard from stories. And I have a lot of stories to tell because we have heard story after story about people saying that they were treated as robots. Ms. Mohammed, who said that she felt the pressure to perform as her duties as robots would. As a stower, she picked up, scanned, and stowed hundreds of items. To keep up with the actual robot that she had on the floor, she didn't take bathroom breaks, she didn't take water breaks, she didn't stretch, and she felt like she was always going to get disciplined. We have heard these stories, and this bill responds to that we've seen all over the country. It responds to a problem that is treating people, not as bodies that need to operate at a pace, but it is treating them like an algorithm. And actually, I heard when I was at the Amazon warehouse, what they said was, we don't actually create our standards based on an ergonomic standard. We don't base it on what other warehouses do. We base it on the speed that our current warehouse is doing. Based on some fancy algorithm, you know what that means? People are speeding up. They're not taking the breaks. We know right now companies like Amazon are prioritizing profits over the safety of their people. And that human cost, that dangerous management practices that discards workers at an incredible turnover rate, that is hurting people. We don't have a standard in Minnesota law that protects those workers. This will do that. We heard from lots of warehouse workers, and I won't belabor or bring up their stories again because we heard from lots of folks who were at warehouses that were actually taking human bodies and their workers seriously. And what Ricky Schreider has said, she is a Teamster who has been here year after year on this bill, is that the success of any business or society for that matter correlates directly with the livelihoods, the health, and the happiness of its people. It's time for Amazon and other companies like it to treat its employees as they should be treated, with respect, dignity, and that is the foundation of their success. So members, I would ask you to listen to the workers who are in the gallery and the hundreds and thousands of workers who are not, who have been telling us that this model is hurting them, that all they need, what they're asking for, is to be told what standard they're being held accountable to and to have access to that data. That's what this bill does. So members, this is a common sense, very simple bill that addresses a really big worker safety problem. Amazon workers today, but frankly, this high-tech, dangerous model, we're trying to make sure it doesn't spread other places. So I'd ask you to listen to the voices of workers. This bill is crafted with them, and please vote yes.
The clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 69 ayes and 60 nays, the bill is passed as amended and its title agreed to.